Welcome to the 2011 Portsmouth Institute of the Catholic Shakespeare. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces. We especially want to welcome those who are coming to Portsmouth Abbey for the first time. They say he is already in the forest of Arden, and many merry men with him there. Well, this weekend so are we, and with many ladies too, thankfully. Is the phrase from As You Like It a reference to Shakespeare's mother's staunchly Catholic family, the Ardens, or to the Ardennes, where Throckmorton started a college for the Catholic sons of English families beyond the reach of Queen Elizabeth's savage oppression of all things Roman? Claire Asquith will illuminate that and many other questions for us tomorrow, just as our other distinguished speakers will enlighten us on the Henry VI plays, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, King Lear, The Tempest, Shakespeare's prayers, and other aspects of this intriguing topic. In July of 1999, a Lancastrian Shakespeare conference and exhibition were held at Houghton Tower at the University of Lancaster. In the closing speech, Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard, author of Will in the World, as well as many other fine books, remarked that he had never before encountered so much excitement and passion. Professor Greenblatt regretted that he could not attend this weekend's conference, but I am delighted that we have been able to entice some of the participants, or shall we call them survivors, of that colloquy and controversies in its aftermath at Portsmouth Abbey in 2011, as well as to welcome other estimable scholars with an interest in questionably in Shakespeare's religious beliefs, so that they can update us on recent research in this field. I'm especially grateful that the father of Catholic Shakespeare studies in recent times, Father Peter Milward, has made the long journey. Father Milward will deliver the keynote address at dinner tomorrow evening. The true origins of this conference, however, might be said to date even further back to October 9th, 1874, when at University College London, the Catholic convert and critic Richard Simpson presented a paper on the politics of Shakespeare's historical plays to the New Shakespeare Society. Simpson was, crucially, also the biographer of St. Edmund Campion, and Gerard Kilroy, who is himself in the process of writing a scholarly biography of Campion, will be speaking to the potential links between Shakespeare and the Jesuit martyr in his presentation on Romeo and Juliet. William Shakespeare was born in 1564 and died in 1616. The Roman Catholic Church had been the official state religion until 1558, and long after the Elizabethan succession it persisted in the hearts and minds of much of the population, especially in the countryside, Warwickshire towns like Stratford, and northern counties such as Lancashire and Yorkshire. Antonia Fraser has written, in fact, Stratford was at the center of the map of Recus in England. Did Shakespeare remain an interior exile, conforming outwardly to the Protestant order, but keeping his true loyalties hidden from the world? Does the recurrent theme of killing the king in his plays denote a divided conscience? These and other questions are complex, and we will hear many arguments brought forth about them. For example, just last week, that great friend of the English Benedictine congregation, Dr. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, opined that William Shakespeare was most probably a Catholic, but also something of a capitalist pig. His Grace did not specifically link these two, so after not too much soul-searching, we're moving forward with these proceedings. As this conference unfolds, we'll hear many references to phrases like recusants, which refers to English Roman Catholics who refuse to attend Anglican services and were fined severely as a result. Church papists, those who did go to Anglican services but were inwardly faithful to Rome. The Bloody Question, Shakeshaft, the Somerville disaster, the Spiritual Testament of St. Charles Borromeo, etc. We have many specialists attending this conference, including, I'm told, no fewer than 5 college and university deans. But we also have many, perhaps a majority, of enthusiastic amateurs. So I would ask our speakers to make an extra effort to explain what may to the non-specialist be arcane terminology, and I would invite our audience to ask as many questions as time allows, but to please keep them brief and to the point. Our aim at the Portsmouth Institute is to enlighten and to inspire, to pray, but also to make merry together at this beautiful monastery and school. If I or anyone here can help you in any way, please don't hesitate to let us know. Meanwhile, for the next 2 sweet spring days, let's away to prison, be it an enchanted forest or a secluded and holy abbey, and take upon us the mystery of Shakespeare's words and things as if we were God's spies. Abbot Kevin has graciously agreed to open the conference by introducing Dom Aidan Bellenger, the Abbot of Downside.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Right Reverend Dom Aidan Bellenger, who was elected Abbot of Downside the summer of 2006. He was born in Hampstead in London in 1950, educated at the Finchley Grammar School and at Jesus College, Cambridge, where he read history. He continued at Cambridge after his graduation and received a PhD in 1978, having been awarded the university's Lightfoot Scholarship in Ecclesiastical History in 1975. He was a supervisor in history at the university and also taught at St. Mary's Convent School in Cambridge. He came to Downside in 1978 as a laymaster and taught until he entered the novitiate in 1982. He was ordained priest in 1988 after a year at St. Anselmo and has been in the school housemaster and headmaster of Downside School, as well as parish priest of at least three Downside parishes. He was prior of Downside from 2001 until his election in 2006 as abbot. He's governor of Downside School, and he has a wide reputation as an historian and is the author of a number of historical books, just a couple of which are English and Welsh Priests, 1558 to 1800. Also the French exiled clergy. He's been editor and co-editor of several books and has had many articles published in learned journals. He has been a visiting lecturer at several universities, including Bristol and Bath Spa, and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Society of Antiquaries. His topic has the arresting title, "The Blasted Heath, the Death of Catholic England."
I was very pleased to be able to put death into my title because when you were introduced, like Abbot Caver very kindly introduced me then, it sounds like your obituary has already been written. And when one's thinking about Shakespeare's obituary, if it were to appear in the conventional form that one sees in newspapers and other journals, religious affiliation is very rarely mentioned in an obituary unless the person has had an ecclesiastical career. And there is, I suspect, nobody who suggests that William Shakespeare was a hidden Jesuit or a secular priest or even a Benedictine. And I'm not suggesting today in my talk that he was a Benedictine or that his contacts with the Benedictines were particularly important. But I think talking here today at Portsmouth Abbey about Shakespeare and about some of the parallels between the end of the English Benedictines and their beginnings is really what my talk is going to be about. Stratford-upon-Avon, presently, its Catholic community is actually served by English Benedictines. And I think that's a point which I want to make at the beginning. Because I know that the parish priest of Stratford-on-Avon has always found it very easy to get priests to celebrate Mass with him when he's away, because there's always the great temptation of a ticket or two to productions at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And so the connection between the Benedictines and present-day Shakespeare is very strong. In the various attempts to identify Shakespeare as a Catholic in the complex world of Elizabethan and Jacobean Christianity, the Benedictines, in contrast to the Jesuits, have hardly featured. This is not surprising, since for much of Shakespeare's lifetime, the monastic order, once so strong a feature in the English religious landscape, had, apart from the memory, all but disappeared. Nevertheless, the English Benedictine congregation was reborn in Shakespeare's lifetime. As King Lear was being written in 1605, some English monks in the Spanish congregation were planning the opening of an English monastery at Douay in the Spanish Netherlands. In 1607, the last surviving monk of Westminster Abbey, Dom Sigebert Buckley, aggregated to himself 2 young monks recently professed in Italy, thus providing a link between the new exiled English monasticism and the pre-Reformation communities. Like Lear, Buckley was an old man, and before his death in 1607, he is said to have gone blind. Edward Mayhew, one of the young monks, remarked that Buckley's eyesight was extinguished at seeing the 2 monks. A later commentator, picturing the old man as seeing with the inward eye the line of his progeny, like Banquo's issue, stretching to the crack of doom. He saw, but blasted with excessive light, closed his eyes in endless night. Another foundation story for the new congregation exists with the Buckley one. In 1603, Augustine Bradshaw, an English monk of the Spanish party, met at Hindlip in Worcestershire a man by the name of William Littleton, who had been a monk of Evesham and was now known as Parson Tinker. The name suggests that he had become a vagabond, tramping the lanes, staggering from place to place. Bradshaw was not dressed as a monk, but Littleton seemed to realize who he was and asked who he was. That was the reply, is a brother of yours. A brother of mine, said Littleton, I've not had any living these 40 years. I mean, answered his informant, a monk of St. Benet's order. At the words, Littleton seemed to alter countenance and be much moved. For the passion of Christ, he pleaded, let me speak to him. He was reconciled by Bradshaw and died, again almost blind, at 100 years old. Those blind old men meeting the new monks somehow or other seem familiar figures. The blasted Heath of my title comes from Macbeth, when Macbeth meets the witches. But the Heath also plays a part in King Lear, where the Heath during a storm finds Lear contending with the fretful elements, becoming the pattern of all patience, and goes mad. The Heath, barren and storm-tossed, can be taken as a paradigm for a society without hope. Whether we identify King Lear as a Christian or post-Christian piece, its encounter in darkness and its paradoxical and disguised characters reminded me of those contemporary meetings of old and new Benedictines. The current production of Macbeth in London's West End is staged in a ruined church. And this seems to be a very suitable setting for the Scottish play, which presents such a broken and disturbed world, in which the weird sisters, equivocators, and ghostly apparitions float in the background. Shakespeare himself uses the image in Titus Andronicus with little care for historically specific detail, but to much effect. In evoking a ruined monastery and a wasted building, he suggests not only the impact of Protestant iconoclasm, but a broken world. So the blasted Heath, the end of Catholic England, which I'm talking about this afternoon, is the end of that crucial cultural heart of Catholic England, the monastic system, which had been part of English society from the 6th century onwards, and which disappeared so drastically, so rapidly, so radically in the years of Henry VIII's reign. John David Knowles, the greatest and most poetic of monastic historians, entitled his abridgment of the final volume of his monumental history of the religious orders in England, published in 1959, Bare Ruined Choirs, an allusion to Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, which has frequently been read as illustrating a strain of Catholic and, yes, monastic nostalgia. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none, or few do hang, upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. Melancholy thoughts on departed greatness may seem inappropriate for those who have been brought up on the idea of an Elizabethan golden age. But the eventual confusion, the life and death debates on religious matters, and the precarious identity of what it meant to be English were as important as swashbuckling nationalism and a newfound national religion in the world of Shakespeare. The very words nationalism and patriotism first came into the English language in the 1590s, suggesting that an older world, a world with different identities, with different emphases, with a different feeling behind it, was there before, and it was not all bad. Around every corner, in every village, scattered across the landscape, was the unmistakable detritus of an abandoned world. The end of the monastic order sounded the death knell of Catholic England. The dissolution of the monasteries was a religious and cultural catastrophe which fundamentally changed the character of England. Between 1536 and 1553, there was destruction and plunder. J.J. Scarisbrick reminds us of beautiful, sacred, and irreplaceable things on a scale probably not witnessed before or since. The monastic spoliation was compounded by the desecration of many of England's parish churches during the drastic Calvinist reorderings under Edward VI and Elizabeth I. To some, this spoliation risked the vengeance of God. To others, it was a suitable conclusion to what amounted to temples of superstition. Any of us, like myself, who love visiting the ancient churches of England, are often surprised by how much is left. But if one thinks about the way in which so much reconstruction took place in the 19th century, and how much of what we now see was hidden away under whitewash and covered in wood, we can see that in Shakespeare's lifetime, the destruction, the contrast, would have been extraordinary. Meditating on the ruins of an abbey, the Puritan Bishop Joseph Hall of Exeter, writing a few years after Shakespeare's death, in 1630 declared, "Every stone have a tongue to accuse the superstition, hypocrisy, idleness, luxury of the late owners." I think he means the monks. "Methinks I see it written all along in capital letters upon these heaps. A fruitful land maketh ye barren for the iniquity of them that shall dwell therein. No roof is so high, no wall so strong, as that sin cannot level it with the dust." Such ideas that the monasteries were closed for good reason and for good riddance became commonplace persisted for centuries. William Gilpin, a lover of the picturesque, visiting the ruins of Tintern in the 1770s, expressed his moral and religious satisfaction at the demise of these nurseries of bigotry and indolence, and stews of sloth, stupidity, and perhaps intemperance. Alexander Walsham's new study, 2011, of the Reformation of the landscape states clearly that the continuing desire to rid the countryside of the British Isles of abominable idols was in part a response to the spectre of Catholic survivalism. Why were the Calvinists so keen on destroying everything? Was it that lurking just below the surface, the Catholic consciousness was ready to break out again? In Walsingham in Norfolk, one of the great Marian shrines of the Middle Ages, the Priory and the Holy House, the centre of the cult, were demolished, and the statue of Our Lady of Walsingham taken to London and burnt. Nostalgia for Walsingham remains strong, and the so-called Walsingham ballad, echoed by Shakespeare's Ophelia in her Madness in Hamlet, was widely popular. The raps of Walsingham, perhaps dating from the 1570s or 80s, and attributed sometimes to Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel, seems now only the sound of owls, where once sweetest hymns were sung, sentiments close to Sonnet 73. Weep, weep, O Walsingham, whose days are nights, blessings turn to blasphemies, holy deeds to despites. Sin is where Our Lady sat, heaven turned is to hell. Satan sits where our Lord did sway. Walsingham, oh, farewell. Walsingham, close to the North Norfolk coast and linked by sea routes to the Low Countries and the Baltic, was cut off from its cultural ties with the wider European world and its Catholic roots. Across England, whole centres of development were brought to a sudden and unexpected end. The dissolution of the monasteries had something of the Baedeker raid about it, targeted attacks on tradition and heritage, cutting society adrift from its former moorings. What was true of the east of England was true too of its Midlands heartlands, the county of Shakespeare. Coventry's St. Michael's Cathedral was a victim of the Blitz of World War II, and its gaunt walls and magnificent spire witness to its past glory. Adjoining its ruins and the new cathedral are the traces of a third cathedral, the Benedictine monastic cathedral, which was demolished under Henry VIII. The Severn Valley, with the county of Worcester at its heart, adjoining Warwickshire, was once home to one of England's greatest concentrations of monastic activity. The cathedrals of Bristol, Gloucester and Worcester, as well as the formerly monastic churches of Pershore, Tewkesbury, Deerhurst and Great and Little Malvern, remain in use as places of worship. Others, like Hales, are now picturesque ruins. Still others, like Winchcombe, have all but disappeared. Evesham, once one of the greatest, founded at the beginning of the 8th century by St. Egwin of Worcester, remains only in a fragmentary state. The Abbey Church, with its great nave, almost 50 metres long, has almost entirely disappeared, and the most substantial surviving building is the elegant perpendicular style freestanding bell tower of 1525 to 30, completed just before the dissolution, a period described by David Knowles as a glow of prosperity during the abbacy of the last abbot, Clement Lichfield, which stands close to the town's two medieval churches of All Saints and St. Lawrence. Lichfield, a grand prelate of the old school, resigned in 1537. In the words of the Worcester antiquary Paddington, he to avoid shipwreck. His gesture was in vain. It was a former monk of Evesham, John Feckenham, who was invited by Mary Tudor to lead a newly endowed Westminster Abbey, of which he took possession as abbot on the 21st of November, 1556. Westminster, adjoining the Palace of Westminster and closely associated with the state as the normal coronation church, had been a Benedictine monastery since before the Norman conquest, and survived the dissolution as a second cathedral for London, with a chapter of dean and canons. Among those who joined Abbot Feckenham was a novice who was to become Dom Sidgwick Buckley. The Westminster community formally ceased to exist on the 15th of July, 1559, and Elizabeth I endowed a new collegiate foundation, which continues up to this present time. Abbot Feckenham is a figure who fits very well into this dislocated world, which I propose was the world in which Shakespeare lived. Feckenham, whose formative years at Oxford had been spent in the twilight of scholastic theology and Erasmian piety, had followed the world in the matters of the royal supremacy and the dissolution of the monasteries, and had, without apparent repugnance, taken up with a normal clerical career. There was in him, however, not a vestige of continental Protestantism, and even while Henry was still alive, he was deploring the advances of heresy. His imprisonment and the actual theological and liturgical disputes of the time seem to have convinced him, as they convinced many others, that a church tied to the monarch and severed from Rome could not long escape chaos and error. From 1553 onwards, Feckenham was consistent in all his actions, defending and maintaining what he considered to be Catholic truth. A tradition records that he was of mean stature, somewhat fat, round-faced, beautiful and of a pleasant aspect, affable and lovely in conversation. A well-informed contemporary saw in him a man of extremely kindly nature, sanguine temperament, and thoughtful cast of mind. And we may picture him with a cornered cap on his head and some fur appearing at the end of his cassock sleeve at his wrist. This figure of Feckenham, I think, is an important one, because Feckenham, in encouraging and allowing the Abbey of Westminster to be reborn and to continue through Sidgwick Buckley into the revived English Benedictine congregation, suggests the way in which just below the surface there were these undercurrents which, although not explicit, which although often concealed, were ready to break forth. And those undercurrents are there continuously whenever we look and think about the writings of Shakespeare. In Westminster Abbey today, so well known to many of us through the recent royal wedding, Feckenham and the Marian monks are remembered alongside their medieval brethren in St. Benedict's Chapel, and St. Edward the Confessor's body remains within its tomb, repaired by Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor herself is buried with her sister Elizabeth, divided by their mothers and by their interpretation of faith, but united, as their joint epitaph suggests, by the hope of resurrection. And there is in that hope of resurrection too a great suggestion of what we're talking about in the background of Shakespeare. In all the terrible religious debates, in all the violence, in all the destruction, there was the hope of resurrection and the possibility of restitution. In the quiet nostalgia, in the memories of people, that possibility existed. Among others who joined Feckenham's Westminster were representatives of other dissolved religious houses, including that of Glastonbury. My own monastery at Downside is in Somerset in the west of England, and Somerset was once dominated by the Abbey of Glastonbury. The name Glastonbury now, at least to people in England, often reminds them of a music festival. And as I left Downside yesterday, I could see the preparations for that music festival beginning. But the Abbey of Glastonbury is now a ruin. It is a very ancient foundation, surrounded in myths which associate the place with the early days of English Christianity, the mythical King Arthur, and much else. In the Middle Ages, it was a great place of pilgrimage, both as the shrine of the Blessed Virgin Mary, probably the oldest in England, and as the burial place of many saints, including, it is said, St. Patrick, although the Irish are not too keen on that. Under its great Abbot Dunstan, subsequently Archbishop of Canterbury, and a saint himself, it was in the 10th century the matrix of Benedictine monastic reform. In the 12th century, under its abbot Henry of Blois, brother to King Stephen, and afterwards Bishop of Winchester, it was a centre of cosmopolitan culture. Its historic site stands below a natural hill, the Tor, a high place with an appropriately dedicated shrine of St. Michael. Those who visit Glastonbury today often find it, at least as far as the Abbey ruins are concerned, a place of great peace. But on the 15th of November 1539, the last Abbot of Glastonbury, Richard Whiting, along with two of his contemporaries, was taken to the bleak and windy summit of the Tor and was executed, evoking the crucifixion itself. The old man's eyes, as he stood beneath the gallows, would have travelled for the last time along the slopes of the clouded hills, over the great expanse of mere to the sharp outlines of the Quantocks, over the distant bridges where the Glastonbury manors had been white with sheep. No other landscape in all England carried so great a weight of legend. Below him lay now the majestic pile of his abbey, desolate, solitary, and about to crumble into ruins. Did he, the last of a long line, think, as we do, of the seed planted at Glastonbury by the first of his predecessors, Dunstan, and of the narrow cloister that was to be the nursing mother of bishops and abbots, so many and so great? We know only that the abbot and his companions took their deaths very patiently, and that Abbot Whiting's head was set up over the gateway of the abbey, which he had robbed, not before hands other than his had stolen thence the life of the building. Local legends suggested that Glastonbury's end had long been prophesied. The Elizabethan magus John Dee, reflecting his Protestant views, saw hypocrisy and pride in its fall. Yet pilgrimage and positive memory continued. An old man told the Jesuit William Weston in 1586 how he carried a reliquary rescued from the desolation as an amulet against the molestation of the spirits. In Mary's reign, indeed, a petition of 4 of the former monks sought a restoration of the monastery. And Michael Dayton, writing in 1622, in his topographical poem, The Collier Albion, evokes a feeling of wistful nostalgia reminiscent of the Walsingham writings. O 3 times famous isle, where is that place that might be with thyself compared for glory and delight? Whilst Glastonbury stood, exalted to that pride whose monastery seemed all others to deride. O who thy ruin sees, whom wonder doth not fill, with our great fathers' pomp, devotion, and their skill? What, did so many kings do honour to that place? For of glass so vilely to deface, for reverence to that seat which hath ascribed been, trees yet to winter bloom, and bear their summer's green. A former monk of Glastonbury, Austin Ringwood, lived as a hermit close to the ruins, and before his death in 1587, insisted that the abbey would one day be repaired and rebuilt for the like worship. The monks of the new English Benedictine congregation identified themselves with the monks of the dissolved monasteries by a shared mission. They were prepared to sacrifice their lives to proclaim what they saw as the ancient faith of their countrymen. In 1610, John Roberts, one of the first of the new Benedictines to die, specifically identified himself on the scaffold with the Gregorian mission and the work of Augustine of Canterbury. He stood alongside contemporary Catholic writers who emphasized that the Catholic faith was a traditional and integral part of being English. The Benedictine tradition places a great emphasis on the Word of God, and the spirituality of the revived Benedictines of Shakespeare's lifetime was more verbal than visual. Augustine Baker rejected the visual images of Jesuit meditation and concentrated more on the cloud of unknowing. Mental prayer replaced liturgical prayer as the centerpiece of the English monastic spirituality. It was a blueprint for a mission without churches and a monasticism without abbeys. It was a response to the new world created by the dissolution, a way forward not envisaged by those who embarked on the pilgrimage of grace in Henry VIII's reign. The abbeys were one of the beauties of the realm, as its leader Robert Aske wrote about the northern desolation. Non-hospitality in these places kept, a kind of wasteland, a blasted heath. It remains an open question whether Shakespeare was a Catholic, but there is enough ambiguity to warrant the question and to understand more fully the world in which he lived. The parallel world of the Benedictine order in the 16th and 17th century, its destruction, its continuation in the hearts and minds of many, and its revival, reflects, in a sense, the mental world of a thoughtful man in Shakespeare's generation. The dissolution of the monasteries and the nostalgia for the monastic past was shared by Shakespeare and his contemporaries, who also sensed the anachronistic and antiquarian nature of the monastic order. This suggests the wider cultural context in which Shakespeare lived, the complexities of religious identity, and the creative tension of religious uncertainty. In the northern monastic cathedral of Durham, the last years of the monks were remembered or invented by the author of The Rites of Durham, probably a work of the 1590s. Though his aim is antiquarian, not controversial, and though he avoids harsh personal and doctrinal references, his sympathies are warmly with the past, and he uses the old traditional phrases, as when he speaks of the Blessed Sacrament, or Our Blessed Lady, or refers to the godly religiousness of monastical life, or the past, never reconciled to the destruction of so much beauty, and dignified ceremonial that had been part of his daily experience in the morning of life. The continuation of traditional ideas and language remains part of Shakespeare's mental landscape. Geoffrey Morehouse, in his recent fictionalized account of the last days of Durham Cathedral Priory, The Last Office, London 2008, sees the old spirit continuing in the new cathedral foundation. I find this unconvincing. Revival, as well as continuity, had its role, and there were sharp ends, as well as new beginnings. The internal shiftings of the party and the evolution of the Christian community in the long Reformation in England is fascinatingly complex. And I imagine many of you have been brought to this institute because of the fascination and the complexity of the questions raised. It's very difficult to identify different groups within the Christian community in England during the Elizabethan and Jacobean period. Indeed, it is difficult to describe the components of the Catholic community itself. Labels like church papist, as Peter Lake suggests, are early modern polemical constructs rather than precise analytical categories, and as such are likely to tell more about contemporary prejudices than about identity. The old ways lurked in the shadows. Gary Waller's recent work on the Virgin Mary, Cambridge 2011, suggests that the figure of the Virgin haunts many of Shakespeare's plays, and again supports the Walsingham ballad as the source of Ophelia's mad lines. He quotes Michael Pestier approvingly in reading too much into the theology of drama. For Pestier, theatre is a sort of player in which participants could adopt and lay aside, ventriloquize and caricature, try on for size, test and discard a whole variety of subject positions. Indeed, for Waller, Hamlet in its cryptic reference to Catholicism, as in everything else, is an unambiguous affirmation of total ambiguity. Whether or not this is the case, we will see, I hope, in the course of this institute. And yet even so quizzical a writer as Waller sees in The Winter's Tale the traces and transformation of the Virgin into early modern culture. The Elizabethan Catholics were finding their own voice, but the Middle Ages died hard, and the memory of the monastic order was at the heart of the Middle Ages. In Shakespeare's England, the Catholic diaspora on the continent had already emerged, and as the exiled community's self-identity as Englishmen and women were important, not least in preserving the values of the stay-at-home Catholics who needed to preserve their symbols and values if they were to survive. The preservation of symbols and values is there too very strongly within the Shakespearean canon. A properly articulated Catholic memory was part of this preservation. A memory which was capable of recall and recapitulation was particularly important. In such plays as All's Well That Ends Well, Heracles and The Winter's Tale, Shakespeare hints at a revival of times past. The dissolution may have epitomized the end of Catholic England, but it was a slow and complex death. It is no surprise that there was so much confusion and melancholy on Shakespeare's blasted Heath. Thank you very much.
To take questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and Frank Pagliaro will bring a microphone to you. Thank you. Frank.
Part of the virulence of the Calvinists and the English Protestants towards Catholics, would it be traced to a disdain for things Italian? I've seen it here.
I find that a difficult question to answer because I think the identity, the national identities of these countries were really just emerging at this time. And it was obvious that things Spanish were not much liked by the official regime. But things Italian, I'm not so sure about. Things Mediterranean rather than Northern were perhaps not regarded with as much interest as they might have been before. Although one always has to remember that the language of, the intellectual language of this period for both sides was still Latin. So the classical culture, which was obviously a strong element of the impact of the Mediterranean world, was as important for those who followed the new doctrines of Calvin, as well as those who followed the old religion. So I think it is a difficult question to answer. You could answer it also in another way, and that is that the Renaissance in its architectural form was very slow in taking on any colour in England.
If I may add a brief comment, the Italians were models of intellectual culture for Elizabethans. I'm thinking Coach Sidney citing Italian critics who knew how to write good plays, whereas English plays were not so good. Shakespeare, he died before Shakespeare wrote, so Sidney was not aware of Shakespeare, but this motif comes up repeatedly. The Italians are much better than we are at doing various kinds of literary art in particular. At the same time, there's a detestation of Italian fashion in clothing and excess and this caricature. So it seems to be a very ambivalent attitude towards it.
What role do you see Catholicism as playing in the future evolution of English national identity?
Talking for 2011, is that?
From now on.
From now on. Well, I think in the present age that England has attempted to present itself as a multicultural society, but at the same time claims to have a national church, the Church of England, which expresses Englishness. And any of you who saw the royal wedding or the visit of the Queen to Ireland or any of the other recent successors of the royal family might think that that particular English identity is still very strong. But I think from the church point of view, it isn't very strong. And I think given the fact that England is a very much more secular society than the United States, in the sense that those who profess Christianity are such a minority of the country, that the most significant group in that minority is the English Catholic minority, and therefore, in that sense, they perhaps express English national identity more strongly in their very cosmopolitan composition than some of the other groups. So from that point of view, I think there is a kind of cultural rebirth, but it's small scale. And I think it would be unfair to suggest that it's anything more than that. So I think from that point of view, that cultural identity is capable of articulation, rebirth, and expansion.
Thank you for the talk. I had heard an argument that the destructions of the monastery had led to a de-emphasis in the visual arts and a stronger emphasis on literature, writing the word in England. Is there anything to that assertion?
I think there probably is, because the emergence of an interest, for example, in the monastic buildings, really comes towards the very end of Shakespeare's life and later on in the 17th century with the growth of antiquarianism. And ignorance about buildings, past buildings, is very, very strong within the English culture and imagination. However, I think this can be exaggerated. because it's very interesting that in 17th century France, where the Benedictines were particularly strong in the academic area, especially in the growth of academic history, they seem to have no interest in medieval architecture, which they regarded as Gothic, old-fashioned, irrelevant to their current interests. And it's very interesting that the English Benedictines, when they built their small-scale monasteries on the continent, or the English Jesuits or the English secular clergy building their new foundations on the continent, tended to adopt local cultural patterns, did not attempt to build in the Gothic style or to look back. In answering your question then, there seems to have been a definite break. The 16th century and the early 17th century are a great period of building in England, but for country houses, domestic buildings, and that kind of thing, not for churches. So again, that's another approach. The English country house during the reign of Elizabeth and the English country houses during the reign of James I, Shakespeare's lifetime, in other words, are among the finest surviving English buildings. So that was visual. There was also a certain patronage of the arts, and obviously under King Charles I, and to a lesser extent James I, there was a royal patronage of the arts, which was genuinely cosmopolitan and visual. So I think one can exaggerate it, but from the ecclesiastical point of view, I think it does make sense.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it very much. What I'm curious about is how did the destruction of the monasteries spill over into the day-to-day lives of the people? What was their loss?
It's a question that's, in a sense, haunted the historical studies of this period, because, for example, in Eamon Duffy's great book on the stripping of the altars, where the extraordinary impact of the Reformation on the physical and spiritual life of every parish in the country becomes very obvious. The monasteries aren't really mentioned, or not very much. And what I really wanted to do today was just to reiterate the importance of the destruction of the monasteries because of the scale of the buildings, the scale of the lands which they owned, and their identity with so many of the central institutions of the country. Many of the major English cathedrals were Benedictine monasteries. Canterbury, Durham, Norwich, Ely, just to mention a few. Westminster Abbey, the Royal Chantry, the Coronation Church was a Benedictine abbey. The part of England where Shakespeare lived, as I suggested, was incredibly full of these places. Now, you might say their impact on the locality was economic rather than spiritual. But it did have a devastating economic impact on some of the areas. However one exaggerates the scale of monastic hospitality. Obviously in a place like Portsmouth, monastic hospitality is enormous. I'm not quite sure it was so big in the Middle Ages. But that was one element. There was the element of all the hangers-on and people who were employed in monasteries. And there was also the fact that many thousands of monks and nuns were displaced. Some of them found work within the Church of England. Others, especially the nuns, had to go home and live with their families. And there was this enormous spreading out of the personnel of the monasteries. Now, John David Knowles, in his famous book on the monasteries, suggested 50 years ago that the monasteries were not in a good state at the time of the dissolution. But more recent studies suggest rather the opposite of that there was a kind of revival in the monastic and religious life at the very moment of its destruction. So, at another answer to that question, I suspect there was an extraordinary setting back of the spiritual life of the country. Rowan Williams' name was mentioned near the beginning, who is very friendly with many of our monasteries in England, and I asked him once what he thought was good about the Reformation. I thought it was a good question to ask him, because he is the head of a Reformed church. And his answer to that was that the quality of religious life, the quality of prayer and so on, was removed from elite establishments like the monasteries and spread much more evenly across the country in terms of domestic religion and so on, which could be an answer. But there is the other side, which I think is the demolition, the removal of so much in the way of positive religious life that was actually done by that. But I think the crucial thing, I would say, is that it is a symbol of the end of Catholic England. Because Catholic England may have begun with the Romans when they were first here, but its rebirth was at the end of the 6th century with the coming of the mission of Augustine of Canterbury, who was a Roman monk. And from that time onwards, the identity of the English Catholic Church was a monastic one. That was completely and utterly blasted out by the dissolution.
Thank you. Can you expand a bit on the context and the historical significance of the diminishment of liturgy and the growth of cloud of knowing or mystical practices?
The expansion of, sorry.
Well, you mentioned the cloud of knowing.
Oh yes, right.
Can you expand on that?
Yes, certainly on that. One of the things that I find very interesting about the revival of the English Benedictines in this period is a move away from liturgy towards contemplative prayer. And Augustine Baker, who I mentioned, who was an early monk, working as a monk during Shakespeare's lifetime. I'm talking here about parallels the whole time. That's why I really gave this talk, because I'm talking about a parallel growth universe, whatever you put, going on at the same time as Shakespeare. Augustine Baker was very keen on contemplative prayer as an ideal, and his work in the English Benedictine monasteries, which were established in the early 17th century in Northern Europe, in Catholic Northern Europe, the Spanish Netherlands and France, included the convent of Cambrai in northern France, where quite a number of the manuscripts of the late medieval English mystics were really used for the first time, and were in a sense rediscovered by these English Benedictines. I was having a discussion yesterday on the way over here with two of the other speakers about the influence of Spanish mystics on English Anglican writers in the early 17th century. They seem to have been more important than the English ones. But in the rediscovery of those English medieval spiritual, mystical writers, the revived English Benedictine congregation played an important role. Why did they move away from liturgy towards contemplative prayer? The simple answer is that their great endowed monasteries no longer existed. The life of prayer is at the heart of a monk's life. The easiest way of praying in that context is contemplative prayer, because it doesn't require great numbers of books or spaces or times. And I think that the English Catholics' contemplative prayer developed and grew at that time. It's interesting that in all the literature of Shakespeare, as a Catholic, or deeply influenced by Catholic writings, the liturgical side of things doesn't seem to be as emphasized as other sides. And I find that interesting. I don't know if that's a satisfactory reflection on that.
Aidan, could you comment on the, perhaps you wouldn't say rivalry, but the different sort of approaches that the Jesuit mission had versus the English Benedictine mission?
The Jesuit mission was seen as part of a much wider strategy of the society across the whole of the world at that stage. and was thought as a part of a missionary strategy. The English Benedictines were very closely associated really only with England. I know since then they have become associated with the English-speaking people on the other side of the Atlantic, but that wasn't envisaged at the time, whereas the Jesuits, of course, were always worldwide in their... The rivalry between the Jesuits and the Benedictines seems to have been centered on the internal politics of the English colony of Valladolid and various other places where Jesuit authorities seemed to be less congenial to some of these Englishmen, perhaps because of their international mission, than they would have been. The word Italian, the anti-Italian feeling that was mentioned there, of course, is very strong in the English college Rome, where an Italian superior was not much liked by some of the English students there. So I find it difficult to contrast them too much, except at that personal level. There is also a level of martyrdom and national identity. I think that the revived early Benedictines were very keen on the idea of martyrdom. This comes out very strongly in the statements of John Roberts and others who were of the first generation, who had been at Valladolid in the Jesuit college there, but had moved into the English Benedictine congregation. The rivalry between religious orders always appeals to people, especially when it comes to making jokes of one kind or another, whether it was a Benedictine, a Jesuit, or Franciscan, or whatever. But I've got a feeling that quite a lot of it in the early 17th century boils down to personalities. And some of the personalities are quite difficult. But the identity of the English Benedictines was with the English mission alone, and remained so until the 19th century. I think Maryland, where there was a certain amount of involvement of English Benedictines, was regarded then as an appendage to England. But I better not get into this dangerous territory.
Aidan Duffy has made a tremendous impact in this country, and I'm wondering if his interpretation of the Reformation is going to have an influence on historians in England as well. How is he being received there?
I think that his impact on Reformation studies in England has been enormous, actually. I think that Aidan Duffy's view of things is now seen as the orthodoxy for Reformation historians in England. And the older school associated with A.G. Dickens, who used to be dominant, which talked about the kind of development of popular Protestantism, is now not regarded as very important at all, and it's hardly ever mentioned. And I think the fact that Aidan Duffy was accompanied by Christopher Haig to a certain degree, because Aidan Duffy, with that very Irish-sounding name, and identified as a Catholic, to the sort of anti-Catholic elements in England, there's a bit of a red rag to a bull. But the fact that you've also got at the same time Christopher Haig, who's an Oxford non-Catholic, who's come to similar conclusions, and many other research students, I think it means that Aidan Duffy is the new orthodoxy in England and has had a tremendous personal impact on that. Dermot McCulloch, who is probably known in the United States as well, who's got a similar job to Aidan Duffy at Oxford, holds a slightly different view to Aidan Duffy, which is more old-fashioned and refers back to the Dickens view of things, but he doesn't seem to have made too much impact on overall perceptions. So I would say that Aidan Duffy's views represent the new orthodoxy in Reformation studies in England. And it's interesting just how quick that change has been. When I was a schoolboy studying the Reformation, if I had made some of the assertions that Aidan Duffy had made, I would have got no marks and I would have never gone to Cambridge. And I think this is an exceptional change over the last 25 years, an enormous change. And I think, in answer to that other question about the identity of English Catholicism in the early 21st century and its continuance, those questions raised about national identity are really terrifically important. And the whole idea of actually talking about Shakespeare as a Catholic is part of that. 30 or 40 years ago, you would have been regarded as really very eccentric if you'd held these views. Nowadays, it is a view which can be seen as plausible and strong. And I think that the whole change in studies around the Reformation have helped that. I suppose you might say, just as a final thought on that of course one of the problems is with the decline of Christianity in England in particular, the confessional comments of some of the Protestant historians carry much less authority because people are not so consciously Protestant. And it intrigues me to know whether people in England who have been traditionally anti-Catholic as part of their national identity remain so, or so strongly now. I think it's more of an open question.
I think we'll stop there. Anyone with further questions can approach the lectern. I'm sure Aidan will be delighted to converse with you. But we have a break and we'll